portion, but if you have done the GI system or if you're on it, just give me a yes or no in the chat so I can know how much of this you guys have had. All right, thank you so much. So someone says not yet. All right, so this will be somewhat of a preview then for what is coming up as far as the gastrointestinal system. So we've got the digestive system. This is pretty much what breaks down food. So we take those food particles, let's say you had a slice of pizza, you're gonna bring that into your oral cavity, you're going to start masticating that, crushing it up into smaller pieces. And so we can bring out or extract the molecular components in that food, the biomolecules, the carbohydrates, the proteins, the fats, and then the nucleic acids. So we can bring out those biomolecules and we can metabolize them for energy. And a lot of these processes, like cellular respiration, we talked about last semester. The digestive system happens along the gastrointestinal tract. So there is the tract itself, which starts in the esophagus. All right, so we have the oral cavity where that grinding and crushing takes place. And then the bolus, which is that ball of food, travels through the esophagus initially, then to the stomach, then to the intestines, small intestines first, large intestine second, and then through the rectum. So it's basically the continuous lumen through which the food particles travel and digestion and absorption take place. Now, there are some accessory organs that help with the process of digestion and help to break those foods down, those food particles down, and help to mobilize those biomolecules. So our salivary glands are one of those groups of accessory organs. And we described these in week 1, the parotid, not the parotid, excuse me. The parotid, the sublingual, and the submandibular. We did talk about those in week 1. Then we have the pancreas and the gallbladder also acting as accessory organs, the pancreas secreting lots of different enzymes that help to break down proteins and fats, and the gallbladder secreting bile that helps to emulsify fat. So you'll talk about the various functions of these, but you kind of want to separate the tract itself from the organs, the accessory organs that release their secretions into the tract. Now, if we think about the collective process, there are 6 processes or steps that are included in breaking food down in this collective digestive process. So there's the ingestion, which is taking food in, eating food, right? Crushing it up in your teeth, grinding it down, and then creating a ball, a semi-solid ball, which we call a bolus. Then there's secretion, and secretion is where those accessory organs come into play. This is how we can release certain substances into the GI tract that will help breaking down those food particles. Digestion is the process of breaking down food particles. Most of digestion happens in the stomach, where there's lots of acid that can really get at those food particles and begin to break them down and begin to expose the biomolecules. Motility is the movement of the tract. This is another really important component. So there's what's called peristalsis. We'll talk about this later on, but it's really the squeezing and relaxing of the tract in various portions to help move the contents along. Absorption is the movement of the digested food, the biomolecules from that digested food, the movement of those molecules across the lumen and into the blood. So really important to distinguish digestion, which is the breaking down, from absorption, which is the uptake into the bloodstream of those biomolecules. And then lastly, defecation. Defecation is the process of expelling waste from the lower parts of the GI tract, specifically the colon, the sigmoid colon, and then eventually the rectum. So defecation is one of the processes where excess or waste can be eliminated. All right, so that's really an overview of the systems and processes that are within the gastrointestinal tract. And again, you'll talk more about those things, the hormones involved, the physiology involved, coming up in your lecture part of the class. We're going to move on to focus a little bit more on some of the anatomical structures. But having an overview of what's happening in the GI, what's happening in the region, will certainly help you commit some of these structures to memory. So the abdominal cavity, we want to start with looking at the outside of this space. It's formed by muscles. These are the muscles that line the anterior abdominal wall. So we have the external oblique. That's the first muscle that you will encounter underneath your skin and subcutaneous fat along the anterior abdomen, specifically along the sides of the abdomen or the flanks, right? The lateral sides. The fibers of the external oblique are going to be running down and inward. So if you think about the orientation of putting your hands in your front pockets, that is the way the fibers of the external oblique run. If we strip away the external oblique, as we have on the right side here, we're going to encounter the internal oblique, okay? And its fibers are running in the opposite direction. They're running down and inward, or down and back, as if you were to try to be putting your hands in your back pockets, okay? So they have opposite fibers in terms of the orientation, and they are going to be layered onto each other along the abdomen. Some of the other muscles that we encounter, so if we strip away external oblique, which is the outer layer here, and then we strip away internal oblique, the second layer here. The third layer that we encounter is the transversus abdominis. And transversus abdominis is running in a horizontal orientation, so very different than the outer two layers. And so as we can see, these help to stratify and really strengthen and reinforce the abdominal wall because they're running in different orientations. Along the midline, we have the rectus abdominis. So this is the longitudinal strap-like muscle. Rectus is the name because rectus is meaning straight. And we'll talk about some other muscles that have rectus in the name. And this is the muscle that we typically associate with the definition of the abdominal wall. This is what we refer to as the abs, especially if it's toned. And that is because of the striations that we can see, or the tendons that kind of separate the span of this muscle and create the different pockets that we typically refer to as abs, right? So rectus abdominis, transversus abdominis, internal oblique, and then outward being the external oblique. If we think about some of the other structures that are not muscles, but are tendinous or ligamentous, the inguinal ligament is a connective structure, a fibrous connective tissue structure that spans from the iliac crest all the way down to the pubis. All right, and that is going to help to do two things. One, it's going to reinforce the abdominal wall. Two is it's going to separate and divide the abdomen from the thigh. So as we think about structures below the inguinal ligament, this is where we begin to encounter the thigh muscles, our quads, quadratus femoris muscles, and our quadriceps, excuse me, and then we can separate what's happening in the abdomen to the thigh. And then the inguinal ligament is also an important landmark for the development of the testes in males. It's going to be the landmark if we think about inguinal hernias. That's kind of the clinical importance of understanding this region and the structures that help to divide these two spaces. The rectus sheath is another important sort of fibrous connective tissue structure. This is the structure along the midline of the abdomen. It's going to help to insert or invest the rectus abdominis muscle. So it's going to be wrapping all around this muscle and also helping to reinforce the integrity of the abdominal wall. Again, preventing things like hernias or bulging of the intestinal contents if there's any high pressure abdominal activity. So if someone is forceful, let's say they're lifting heavy weights or they are constipated, that kind of pressure can help the intestines to bulge through various parts of the abdominal wall, which is how we have different types of hernias. So these muscles and these sheaths and these ligaments help to prevent those hernias from taking place. Let's turn our attention to the posterior abdominal wall. So this is the back side of the abdomen. So if we took away the entire anterior abdominal wall, took out the entire gastrointestinal tract, all of the intestinal organs, and we looked at the back of the abdominal wall, this is what we would see. So it's an anterior view of the posterior wall. The muscles that are here are the psoas minor and psoas major. So these two fleshy muscles that are along the back of the abdominal wall, really the flanks, right? If you think about the lower lumbar flanks, this is where we have the psoas muscles. And they arise from the vertebral bodies and go all the way down and insert on the femur. So they're going to cross from the pelvis and go right into the thigh. Next is the iliacus. And the iliacus is a fan-shaped muscle, and it's found in the internal aspect or the internal cavity of the ilium. So you would have talked about the ilium bone last semester. And so running along the inside of that ilium will be your iliacus muscle, also spanning across the pelvis and then eventually inserting into the femur in the thigh. All right. And so these muscles are really helping to flex the hip, right? If you think about the action of flexion of the hip, so kind of bringing your thigh closer to your abdomen, that's going to be the main action of these muscles. And you can see that they play a strategic role as they span that hip joint. Let's talk about the nerves that we encounter in this space as well. So the femoral nerve, this one, we talked about in the lower limb because it certainly innervates most of the lower limb muscles, but it's going to be passing in between the two muscles we just described. So the psoas major and the iliacus is where the fibers that arise from the spinal cord and converge to form the femoral nerve are actually passing. And then the femoral nerve will continue to split into several branches, and then it's going to innervate all of the muscles of the anterior compartment of the thigh, your vastus lateralis, medialis, your rectus femoris. All of your quad muscles will be innervated by femoral nerve. All right, let's get into the abdominal cavity itself and speak about the visceral organs. So we're moving away from the structural components, which are the muscles, and getting more into the actual functional organs of the GI. So the lining of the abdominal cavity, we call it the peritoneum. And we've encountered structures that are similar to the peritoneum. We've talked about the pericardial sac. We've talked about the pleural sac, which is around the heart and lungs, respectively. The third example of this serous type of cavity is the peritoneum. And it's going to have a visceral layer, which is tightly adhered to the organs themselves, and then a parietal layer, which is tightly adhered to the outer abdominal wall or to the omentum, right? That's adhered outwardly. So this is what creates that serous cavity, that peritoneal cavity, which has a small amount of serous fluid. So this is not an actual space. This is a potential space. There's a small amount of fluid there, but these two layers are tightly adhered to each other, and there's that fluid that allows for lubrication with the movement of the GI. All right, so if we think about looking at the visual here, here's the parietal peritoneum. Notice how it's tightly adhered to the outer aspects or the abdominal wall, the posterior abdominal wall, along with the anterior abdominal wall. Okay, now because the kidneys are what we refer to as being retroperitoneal, they're behind the peritoneum, they are not covered on all sides by this layer, right? They're going to be actually outside of the peritoneum. But the stomach, the pancreas, the spleen, as we can see, these are going to be intraperitoneal organs. These are going to be covered on all sides by the peritoneal layer. Okay, and we can see that visceral peritoneum, which is covering these organs. Now we have to speak about the mesentery. So the mesentery is the double fold of the peritoneum. Okay, if you think about the connection here, I'm going to jump back to this slide. This connection between the visceral layer and the parietal layer that has the blood vessels, and the arrows here indicate that the arteries that are feeding the intraperitoneal organs, the veins that are feeding the intraperitoneal organs, the nerves that are innervating the intraperitoneal organs, those structures, those vessels and nerves will pass through what's called the mesentery, which is the connection between the organs inside the peritoneum and the connection to the body wall, the connection to the posterior abdominal wall. So take the abdominal aorta, for example. It's going to give off these smaller arteries that are going to travel in the mesentery to reach the organs in the peritoneum and feed those organs. So that is going to be referred to as the mesentery. And on that basis, there are two folds of the mesentery. There's the greater omentum, the outer pocket here, which is the large sort of curtain-like flap that covers the gastrointestinal organs. In fact, if you were to open up a cadaver and you were to incise the muscles, right, the rectus abdominis muscle, and reflect those back, and then you will incise the subcutaneous fat and reflect that back, the first thing that you would encounter would be the greater omentum. And you would have to sort of reflect that back in order to access and see the various organs in the GI. So this is the greater omentum. The lesser omentum is another fold of the peritoneum, which is actually a much smaller connection in between the liver and the stomach. So we would have to really get deep into the greater omentum, deep into the GI organs, and reflect the liver. So here's the liver on the right side, the upper right quadrant. Reflect that fold of the liver to really be able to access and see the lesser omentum. All right. Let's speak about the esophagus. So we're going to speak about the entire tract from the proximal end all the way through, starting with the esophagus. So it's longer in the thorax than in the abdomen, so it's the much longer connection happens from the pharynx down to the stomach. And then it's going to actually pierce the diaphragm. We talked about the fact that it has to go through that diaphragm, and then it's going to become the stomach. It's going to be continuous with the stomach. It's one of the three structures that goes through the diaphragm. So the aorta going through the diaphragm, the esophagus goes through the diaphragm, and then the inferior vena cava, which is not shown in this view, also goes through the diaphragm. And so these structures are traversing the thorax and then eventually making their way into the abdomen. All right, let's talk about the stomach now. So from the esophagus, we get the stomach. The stomach is a J-shaped organ. It is essentially picking up the contents that are coming down from the esophagus, and it's going to be a storage tank that helps to mix and mold and churn and process that bolus of food, and it's going to turn it into what's called chyme. Chyme is really that more liquefied a version of the bolus of food. Here it has acid mixed into it. It has some of the stomach enzymes mixed into it. And it's really now easier to flow through the distal parts of the GI tract. That is the duodenum, the small intestines, where that absorption can be a whole lot easier. The parts of the stomach are the greater curvature, so the larger side of this organ, the lesser curvature being the smaller side of this organ. Again, here is where we have the lesser omentum, which connects the liver to the stomach. Then we have the fundus of the stomach, the top portion here. We've got the body of the stomach, which is mainly the central portion. And then we have the pylorus. The pylorus is the distal part of the stomach where it begins to narrow to form the duodenum. Along the pylorus, we also have the sphincter. And a sphincter is a smooth muscle bundle that really helps to regulate the flow. So we don't want all that chyme just kind of leaking out of the stomach into the duodenum. We want to kind of regulate how that flow is being communicated down to the duodenum. So the pylorus has this thickened, smooth muscle. If you look at this image here, this is a slice through the internal pylorus, and you can see that thickened muscle, which forms a sphincter to help regulate the flow of chyme to the duodenum. Moving down to the small intestine. So this is starting at the stomach and then ending at the ascending colon. Here we have the duodenum, and the duodenum is the proximal C-shaped organ that is the first part of the small intestine. The jejunum is where we have the second portion of the small intestine. It's going to be where we have the mesentery, again, connecting those blood vessels and those nerves that are supplying the intestines. And the jejunum is typically going to be in the upper left quadrant, right? The intestines are kind of all bundled in there. So there's no really clear demarcation, but typically that upper left quadrant is where the jejunum will reside. The ileum is going to be the larger portion. It's going to be the area that kind of spills over into the lower right quadrant. So the opposite quadrant is going to be where we have the ileum. And then the ileum will connect to the ascending colon by way of the ileocecal junction. So the junction in between the ileum and the cecum, there's also the presence of this ileocecal valve, again helping to regulate the flow of material or content that's going from ileum into the ascending colon. All right, and then from there we begin the colon. So starting at the ileocecal junction or the cecum, which is the beginning of the ascending colon, here is where we have the appendix, the vermiform appendix, which is really, it's a vestigial or an appendage organ. It's basically a representative of a structure that used to have immune function. But in the adult life, it really doesn't have a clear defined role. It's thought to help mature the immune system, right? But typically it can become inflamed, it can become infected. I'm sure you guys have heard about appendicitis. It's fairly common where there's a lot of abdominal pain, and it can actually become very complicated and very serious. And so if anyone is having an appendix reaction or appendicitis, the first step is just to remove it. Again, it has no clear function, so we typically go in and just take it right out, and those symptoms will resolve. So that is your appendix. Then you have the ascending colon, which is the purple portion here, which is the upward area of the colon. And then we have the right flexure. So this is where the colon takes that turn or takes a bend. This is also referred to as the hepatic flexure because it's in really close contact with the liver. And then we have the transverse colon, which runs across the abdomen, right? That's going from right to left in terms of the flow of contents. And then this will also end in the left colic flexure, also referred to as the splenic flexure. This is where the ascending colon takes the bend to become the descending, or sorry, this is where the transverse colon takes the turn to become the descending colon. From there, we have the sigmoid colon, which is where it takes this S-like turn. That's why it's referred to as sigmoid. And then we encounter the rectum, which eventually leads to the opening, which is the anus. So this is our entire GI tract from esophagus all the way through to the rectum. If we think about some of the external features of the large intestine or the colon, there are some features that we can look at externally that help us to distinguish the colon from the small intestine, for example. One is the haustra, and the haustra are the outpouchings or pockets, excuse me, of the outer wall of the colon. All right, so the haustra are formed by what's called the tinea coli, and the tinea coli is this longitudinal fibrous band. So you can see sort of deep here, there's a fibrous band running all the way down the length of the colon. And that kind of starts to gather the colon. If you think about pulling, a drawstring in your pants really tight, and then the pants starts to kind of bubble up, that's the same effect that's happening here. The tinea coli running longitudinally acts as sort of an elastic band that begins to gather the outer wall of the colon into these haustra or these pockets. The third feature that is unique to the colon is the omental or epiploic appendices. And these are the fatty appendages or fatty strips that are hanging from the outer colon. And if you go back to the smaller intestine, notice that those are not structures. I'm sorry. Okay, I was looking for another picture here. Doesn't seem like I have to. All right, but if you look at the small intestine, they're free from any fatty appendages on the outer wall. So having these epiploic appendices is really a unique way to distinguish the colon from the other parts of the intestine. All right, let's talk about some of the accessory organs. So the pancreas for one, the pancreas runs across the posterior aspect of the stomach. So here's the stomach. You would have to reflect that upward to really be able to see the pancreas. The pancreas has the head, the body, and then the tail. Its function is to release exocrine juices, digestive juices, which are basically a cocktail of enzymes. Enzymes that will help to break down food. So there's lipases that break down fat, trypsin that breaks down proteins, and just a collection of enzymes that help to break down the different types of biomolecules that are coming through the GI tract. All right, and those are going to be dumped specifically into the duodenum. So both the gallbladder, which we'll talk about, and the pancreas are going to release their secretions by way of ducts into the duodenum so that it can encounter that chyme as soon as it leaves the stomach and begins working its way through the duodenum. Now, the pancreas also has an endocrine portion, and we spoke about this in the endocrine part of this last semester, where we talked about insulin being secreted, glucagon being secreted, and these are secreted from the islets of Langerhans, if you remember that term. Those are the pockets of endocrine cells that are found in the pancreas that are dispersed in between the exocrine parts of the gland. So the pancreas is really a dual functioning gland, right? It's going to release some substances by blood. Those are going to be hormones, and that is the endocrine part. And it's going to release some substances by ducts. Those are going to be digestive enzymes, and that is going to be the exocrine part of the gland. Let's talk about the liver. And the liver is a really important organ. It's the largest visceral organ in our body. It's about 2.5% of our total body weight, so even more heavier proportionally than, say, the brain or any other organ. It's in the upper right quadrant of the body. It's going to process all of our nutrients. The liver has a huge job. It has a really large task. It has to process all of the blood from all of the food that we've eaten. So basically, blood that's coming from the stomach, blood that's coming from the duodenum, from the jejunum, ileum, the large intestine, small intestine, all of the blood that is draining and absorbing biomolecules as contents move through the lumen, that has to be filtered into the blood, or into the liver, excuse me, or transported into the liver rather, by way of the portal vein. And then that can help to process all of those nutrients. And when we say process, we mean this helps to determine where we can package these nutrients, how we can absorb what's needed immediately, but then store the rest away in the form of glucagon for a later time. And so the liver has to really take sort of an executive function and determine what's coming in, what do we need right now, what can we package, where do we need to send these other things, and really absorb and process all of the biomolecules that we ingest. Now, the liver has two lobes. It has a right lobe, which is larger, and then a left lobe, smaller. It also has a falciform ligament, which is separating both lobes, and that runs right down the middle, and that is actually adhering or attaching to the anterior abdominal wall. If we think about the liver, we also have to think about the biliary system. So the biliary system is where we store and transport bile. So bile is made in the liver, but then it is transported by way of ducts into the gallbladder. And the gallbladder really only stores that bile and releases it slowly whenever the right food contents come through the duodenum. And that is basically fat. All right, the function of bile is to emulsify fat, to make it more easy to digest and break down. So the ducts that help to transport that bile are the right hepatic duct, left hepatic duct. These are coming from the right and left lobes respectively. Then we have the cystic duct, and the cystic duct works by retrograde transport. So that bile that comes down, that's made from the liver, actually flows back into the gallbladder and is stored here temporarily, and then it can be released when it is needed in the duodenum. From there, we have the common hepatic duct, which is the combination of right and left, and then we have the common bile duct, which is the final duct that drains right into the duodenum. In the duodenum, we have the major duodenal papilla, which is the opening that allows that bile to flow into the duodenum. So very similar with the pancreas, these secretions have to be released into the first part of the intestine to begin breaking down or digesting and absorbing